The gunshot echoed across the Wyoming plains as Rebecca Foster ducked behind the worn counter of her father's general store, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild stallion. It wasn't the first time she'd hidden from her father's drunken rage, but at 22, she'd sworn it would be the last. Blood trickled from her split lip as she wiped it with trembling fingers, knowing that in Cody, Wyoming, in 1879, a woman had precious few options to escape a life of brutality. The floorboards creaked under her father's heavy boots. "Get back here, girl. Think you can talk back to me?" His words slurred together as they always did after he'd emptied a bottle of whiskey. Rebecca clutched the small bundle of saved coins wrapped in a handkerchief, her ticket to freedom, though she had no idea where that freedom might lead. 5 years of secretly saving pennies after her mother's death had given her enough for a stage ticket, but not enough for a life. "You worthless little!" Her father's voice broke as he stumbled, crashing into a display of canned goods. Rebecca seized her chance, slipping through the back door into the alley. The cool spring air kissed her flushed face as she ran, her worn boots barely making a sound on the dirt street. She had no destination in mind, only escape. She rounded the corner and collided with a solid wall of a man. Strong hands steadied her before she could fall backward. "Whoa there, miss," a deep voice drawled. Rebecca looked up into the weathered face of Sheriff Thomas, his gray mustache twitching with concern as he took in her appearance. "Rebecca, what in heaven's name happened to you?" Her fingers instinctively went to her swollen lip. "Nothing, Sheriff. Don't you lie to me, girl." "Your father again." His kind eyes hardened. "That's the 3rd time this month I've seen you like this." Rebecca felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her. Sheriff Thomas was a good man, but the law could only do so much. Her father was the only store owner in town, and folks depended on him. "You can't keep living like this," the sheriff said gently, leading her toward his office. Inside, he handed her a handkerchief for her lip and settled behind his desk with a sigh. "I've got a letter here." He shuffled through some papers. "Might be an answer to your troubles." Rebecca watched him skeptically. "Fellow named Matthew Vance. Got a spread about 30 miles from here. Lost his wife to fever 2 years back. He's looking for a bride." "A mail-order bride," Rebecca's voice cracked. She'd heard stories of such arrangements, women desperate enough to marry strangers sight unseen. Sheriff Thomas nodded. "He's a decent man. I've known him some years now. Hard-working, owns a good piece of land. Doesn't drink, far as I know." "You're suggesting I marry a stranger to escape my father?" The idea seemed absurd, yet a small flame of possibility flickered in her mind. "I'm suggesting you consider all your options, Rebecca. Your father's getting worse. Next time it might not just be a split lip." She knew he was right. Her father had always been harsh, but since her mother's death, something had broken inside him, turning him vicious and unpredictable. "Let me write to him," Sheriff Thomas offered. "He can come to town, you can meet him proper. If you don't take to him, no harm done." Rebecca twisted her hands in her lap, weighing the unknown against the certain misery of her current life. "All right," she whispered finally. "Write to him." 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Rebecca endured her father's temper, dodging his fists when possible, bearing his blows when not. Each night, she added to her small bundle of possessions hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room a photograph of her mother, a small book of poetry, a faded blue ribbon. When word came that Matthew Vance would arrive on Saturday's stage, Rebecca felt sick with nerves. She'd never considered herself much to look at, tall and lean with auburn hair and freckles across her nose that refused to fade with age. Her green eyes, her mother once said, were her finest feature, but Rebecca doubted a man seeking a wife would care much about that. Saturday dawned bright and clear. Rebecca wore her best dress, a faded blue calico that had once belonged to her mother, taken in at the waist and let out at the hem. She pinned her hair carefully, covering the yellowing bruise at her temple with a carefully arranged curl. The stage rolled into Cody at noon, dust billowing around the wheels as it came to a stop. Rebecca waited beside Sheriff Thomas, her stomach in knots. 3 passengers disembarked: a plump woman with 2 small children, a traveling salesman with a case of samples, and finally, a tall man in a dust-covered coat. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. He looked older than Rebecca had imagined, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a face tanned and lined from years under the western sun. "That's him," Sheriff Thomas murmured. "Matthew Vance." The man's eyes scanned the small crowd, settling on the sheriff. Recognition flashed across his face, and he strode toward them with confident steps. "Sheriff Thomas," he greeted, his voice deep and steady. His eyes moved to Rebecca, taking in her appearance with a thoroughness that made her cheeks warm. "This is Miss Rebecca Foster," the sheriff introduced. Matthew Vance extended a calloused hand. "Miss Foster, a pleasure." Rebecca placed her trembling fingers in his, surprised at the gentleness of his grip. "Mr. Vance, Matt, please." A slight smile curved his lips, revealing a dimple in his left cheek that softened his otherwise solemn expression. They took their meal at the hotel restaurant, the sheriff joining them as chaperone. Rebecca picked at her food, too nervous to eat, while Matthew asked polite questions about her life in Cody, carefully avoiding any mention of her father or the circumstances that had led her to consider his offer. "My ranch isn't much compared to some," he explained. 300 acres, good water. I run about 100 head of cattle. The house is solid 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen. I built it myself when I came west in '68. Rebecca nodded, trying to picture this life so different from the cramped rooms above the general store where she'd spent her entire existence. "It's lonely work," he continued, his deep voice dropping lower. "A man needs companionship, a woman's touch about the place." His eyes met hers. "I'm not looking for a servant, Miss Foster. I'm looking for a partner." "And what would you expect of this?" "Partner." Rebecca found her voice at last. A shadow passed over his face. "Loyalty, honesty. I'd expect you to keep house, help with the garden. I'd provide for you, protect you. You'd want for nothing I could give. And if it doesn't suit me, if I find I can't." She couldn't finish the thought. "Then I'd bring you back to town," he said simply. "I'm not in the business of keeping anyone against their will." Sheriff Thomas cleared his throat. "Matt's a man of his word, Rebecca." After dinner, Matthew walked her to the edge of town, maintaining a respectable distance. The spring air had cooled and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I know this isn't ideal," he said finally. "Marrying a stranger." Rebecca looked up at him, studying his profile. There was kindness in his weathered face and something else, a sadness, perhaps, that matched her own. "My life here isn't ideal either, Mr. Vance," he nodded, understanding more than she'd said. "I saw the bruise you tried to hide." His voice was gentle, not accusing. "Your father—" Rebecca looked away, shame washing over her though she'd done nothing wrong. "I won't ever raise a hand to you," he promised. "No matter what." The words hung between them, a covenant more binding than any marriage vow could be. "When would you want to marry?" she asked, her decision already made though she hardly dared admit it to herself. "I'd need 3 days to prepare things at the ranch. Would Thursday suit?" "Thursday. 4 days to change her entire life." "Yes," she whispered. "Thursday would suit." They parted ways at the edge of town, Matthew returning to the hotel, Rebecca to the store. Her father was passed out behind the counter when she entered, an empty bottle beside him. She slipped past him up to her room, where she sat on her narrow bed and tried to imagine being Matthew Vance's wife. The thought terrified her, yet the alternative terrified her more. The next morning she told her father she was leaving. His rage was immediate and violent. He smashed bottles, overturned displays, called her terrible names. When his hand connected with her face, sending her sprawling, Sheriff Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "That's enough, Foster," he barked, hand on his pistol. "She's my daughter. She'll do as I say." Her father's face was mottled with fury. "She's a grown woman making her choice," the sheriff countered. "And if you lay another hand on her, you'll answer to me." Rebecca gathered her meager belongings while the sheriff kept watch. Her father's curses followed her out the door, promises of retribution that chilled her blood despite the morning sun. "You can stay at the hotel until Thursday," Sheriff Thomas offered. "I'll arrange it." The next 3 days passed in a blur. Rebecca purchased fabric for a new dress with some of her saved money, and the hotel owner's wife helped her sew it, a simple blue gown with a white lace collar, the nicest thing she'd ever owned. On Thursday morning, she dressed with shaking hands. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a dull yellow, and her split lip had nearly healed. She arranged her hair carefully, securing it with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. The ceremony was brief, held in the sheriff's office with the hotel owner and his wife as witnesses. Matthew wore a clean black suit, his dark hair slicked back. He placed a simple gold band on her finger, his hand steady while hers trembled. "I, Matthew James Vance, take thee, Rebecca Ann Foster, to be my lawfully wedded wife." His voice was clear and strong, filling the small room with a certainty Rebecca couldn't share but desperately wished to believe. When it was done, when she was Rebecca Vance instead of Rebecca Foster, they loaded her trunk onto his wagon. The town of Cody fell away behind them as they headed west, toward the mountains that had always marked the boundary of Rebecca's world. They traveled in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of the horses' hooves. Rebecca watched the landscape change, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. "You all right?" Matthew asked finally, glancing her way. "Yes," she lied, clutching the edge of the wagon seat. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "It's all right to be scared, Rebecca." The sound of her name on his lips sent a strange shiver through her. "I'm not sure what to call you," she admitted. "Matt will do, or Matthew if you prefer." He handled the reins with easy confidence. "We've got a couple hours' ride yet. You might want to get comfortable." They stopped once by a small stream to water the horses and stretch their legs. Matthew handed her a canteen and a packet of jerky wrapped in waxed paper. The simple consideration that he'd thought to bring food for the journey made her throat tighten unexpectedly. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains when they crested a hill, and Matthew pulled the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said, pointing ahead. "Vance Ranch." Rebecca's eyes followed his gesture. Below them, a valley spread out, green and lush compared to the drier plains around Cody. A creek wound through it like a silver ribbon, and in the center stood a house larger than she'd expected, with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. "Who's tending the fire?" she asked, suddenly concerned they weren't alone. "Mrs. Winters from the next property over. She's been helping out since." He didn't finish the sentence. "She'll be gone now." They continued down into the valley, the wagon bumping over the rutted trail. As they drew closer, Rebecca could make out a barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. A few cattle grazed in a nearby pasture. Matthew pulled up before the house and set the brake. For a moment, neither moved. Then he jumped down and came around to her side, offering his hand to help her descend. Rebecca placed her fingers in his and stepped down onto what was now her home. The house was surprisingly welcoming inside, clean and well-ordered, with solid furniture and colorful braided rugs on the plank floors. A fire burned in the stone hearth, and a pot of stew simmered on the iron stove. "Mrs. Winters must have left that," Matthew said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "She's a fine cook." Rebecca stood in the center of the main room, taking it all in the table with 4 chairs, the comfortable-looking armchair by the fire, the bookshelves filled with volumes she itched to explore. "Let me show you the rest," Matthew offered, leading her through a short hallway. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a proper pump at the sink and shelves stocked with provisions. A small room off it served as a pantry. "This is our bedroom," he said, opening a door off the main room. Rebecca's heart stuttered at the words "our bedroom." A large bed dominated the space, covered with a colorful quilt. A wardrobe stood against one wall, a washstand against another. Matthew must have sensed her discomfort. "You'll have it to yourself for now," he said quietly. "I'll take the other room until you're ready." Relief washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered. He showed her the second bedroom, smaller, with a narrow bed and chest of drawers, and the bathhouse attached to the back of the house, a luxury Rebecca hadn't expected. "I'll bring in your trunk," he said when the tour was complete. "You must be tired from the journey." Left alone, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, her bed in her room in her house. The enormity of what she'd done crashed over her. She'd married a stranger to escape her father's cruelty, trading one unknown for another. What if Matthew Vance's kindness was merely a mask? What if, alone on this isolated ranch, he revealed a nature as cruel as her father's? There would be no sheriff to intervene, no hotel to shelter her. When Matthew returned with her trunk, she had composed herself, though her hand still trembled slightly. "I thought we might have supper," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "The stew smells ready." They ate at the kitchen table, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. The stew was indeed excellent, rich with beef and vegetables. "Mrs. Winters left bread too," Matthew said, passing her a cloth-covered basket. "She seems very kind to do all this." "She is. Her husband died in the war. She has a small place about 5 miles east with her son. He helps me sometimes with the cattle." Rebecca nodded, filing away the information. Neighbors, even distant ones, were good to know about. After supper, Matthew showed her where everything was kept in the kitchen, then excused himself to check on the livestock. Left alone, Rebecca washed the dishes and explored the house more thoroughly, running her fingers over the spines of books, examining the few photographs on the mantel. One showed a younger Matthew with a woman, both smiling. His wife, Rebecca assumed, feeling a strange pang. She'd been pretty, with dark hair and a sweet smile. When Matthew returned, he found Rebecca seated in the armchair with a book open on her lap. He stood in the doorway watching her for a moment before she noticed him. "I hope you don't mind," she said, closing the book quickly. "I love to read." "I don't mind at all. They're your books now, too." He moved to the fire, adding a log. "Emma loved that one, Dickens." Rebecca glanced down at Great Expectations in her hands. "Emma was your wife?" "Yes." His voice was steady, but his eyes held that sadness she'd noticed before. "She would have liked you." The simple statement touched Rebecca deeply. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said softly. Matthew nodded. "It's been 2 years. Life goes on." He straightened, suddenly businesslike. "I've put fresh water in the bathhouse if you want to wash up. I'll stay out here until you're settled." Rebecca gathered her nightgown and robe from her trunk and made her way to the bathhouse. The water was still warm, and she luxuriated in it, washing away the dust of travel and the lingering shadow of her old life. When she returned to the house, hair damp and face flushed from the warm water, Matthew was banking the fire for the night. "I'll be in the small room if you need anything," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Good night, Rebecca." "Good night, Matt," she replied, testing the shortened name. A small smile touched his lips before he turned away. In the bedroom, her bedroom, Rebecca slid between clean sheets that smelled of sunshine. The mattress was softer than any she'd slept on, the pillow plump and comfortable. Despite her anxiety about this new life, exhaustion claimed her quickly, and she fell into a dreamless sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't recall where she was. Then memory flooded back: the wedding, the journey, Matthew Vance. Dressing quickly in her old calico, she made her way to the kitchen. Matthew stood at the stove, his back to her. He'd already dressed for the day in a faded blue shirt and worn denims. "Good morning," she said softly. He turned, spatula in hand. "Morning, hope you're hungry." "You didn't have to cook," she said, moving toward the stove. "That's my job now. Thought you might need rest after yesterday." He deftly transferred bacon to a plate. "Besides, I've been cooking for myself for 2 years. One more day won't kill me." They ate at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the east-facing window. Matthew explained his daily routine: up before dawn to tend the livestock, working the land or the cattle depending on the season, repairs to the buildings and fences as needed. "What would you have me do?" Rebecca asked when he'd finished. "Whatever you're comfortable with. The house is yours to run as you see fit. There's a garden out back that needs tending. Emma always grew vegetables and such. I've kept it going best I could, but I don't have her touch with growing things." After breakfast, Matthew showed her the garden, a good-sized plot behind the house with rows of early spring vegetables pushing through the soil. A small orchard of apple trees stood beyond it, their branches covered in pink-white blossoms. "It's beautiful," Rebecca breathed, already imagining what she might plant in the empty spaces. "Garden tools are in the shed there," Matthew pointed. "Seeds too, though they might be old. We can get new ones next time we go to town." "We." The word struck Rebecca oddly. She wasn't accustomed to being part of a we. As the days passed, Rebecca settled into life at the ranch. She learned the rhythms of the place: when Matthew left in the morning and returned for the midday meal, which chickens laid the most eggs, how to work the temperamental pump when it stuck. Matthew kept his distance, never entering her bedroom, speaking to her with unfailing politeness. He answered her questions about the ranch patiently, seemed pleased with the meals she prepared, and thanked her when she mended his shirts. A week after her arrival, Rebecca was in the garden when a wagon appeared on the road to the ranch. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. A woman drove the wagon, a young man beside her. "Mrs. Winters," Matthew called from the barn where he'd been repairing a stall. "And young Daniel." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron and went to greet their visitors. Mrs. Winters was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She looked Rebecca up and down with frank assessment. "So you're Matt's new bride," she said, extending a work-roughened hand. "Sarah Winters. This is my son, Daniel." Daniel, a gangly youth of perhaps 18, nodded shyly, his eyes darting to Rebecca's face and then away. "Rebecca Vance," she replied, the name still unfamiliar on her tongue. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for the stew and bread you left. It was delicious." Mrs. Winters's stern expression softened slightly. "Least I could do. Brought you some preserves today, peach and blackberry, and some of my sourdough starter if you've a mind to bake." "That's very kind," Rebecca said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thought you might want company too. Ranch life can be lonely for a woman." Matthew appeared beside them. "Mrs. Winters, Daniel, good to see you, Matthew." Mrs. Winters nodded. Daniel's come to help with that broken corral fence. Appreciate it." Matthew clapped the young man on the shoulder. "It's a two-man job for sure." While the men worked on the fence, Mrs. Winters helped Rebecca harvest early lettuce and radishes from the garden. The older woman was brisk but kind, offering advice about the ranch and the changing seasons. "Winter's hard here," she warned. "You'll want to put up all you can from the garden. Matt's good about keeping meat on the table, but vegetables are scarce come January." "I've never preserved food before," Rebecca admitted. "My father owned the general store in Cody." Mrs. Winters's shrewd eyes took in the faint yellow bruise still visible on Rebecca's cheekbone. "I know Roger Foster," she said flatly. "Mean drunk. My husband traded with him years back." Rebecca said nothing, but her silence was confirmation enough. "Well," Mrs. Winters continued, her voice softening, "you've done well for yourself with Matthew. He's a good man. Treated Emma like a queen, he did. Did you know her well?" Rebecca couldn't help asking, "since she was a girl." "Our families came west together." Mrs. Winters's eyes grew distant. "The fever took her so fast, 3 days from first cough to last breath, nearly destroyed Matthew." Rebecca glanced toward the corral where Matthew worked alongside Daniel, his movements efficient and strong. "He doesn't speak of her often," she said quietly. "He wouldn't. Keeps things close, does Matthew, but he's grieved proper and now he's moving forward." Mrs. Winters fixed Rebecca with a direct look. "He wouldn't have married again if he wasn't ready." They shared the midday meal together, a simple affair of cold chicken, bread, and the fresh vegetables from the garden. Afterward, Mrs. Winters showed Rebecca how to start the sourdough and promised to return in a week to teach her about preserving. As the wagon disappeared down the road, Matthew stood beside Rebecca in the yard. "She likes you," he said, sounding slightly surprised. "How can you tell?" A small smile curved his lips. "She gave you her sourdough starter. Wouldn't part with that for just anyone." That night, Rebecca baked her first loaf of sourdough bread. The result wasn't perfect, the crust a bit too dark, the inside a touch too dense, but Matthew declared it excellent, eating 2 thick slices with his supper. As April melted into May, the days grew warmer. Rebecca's garden flourished under her care, producing more than the two of them could eat. Following Mrs. Winters's instructions, she began preserving. The bounty jars of pickled vegetables lined the pantry shelves, and bunches of herbs hung drying from the rafters. Matthew brought her wildflowers sometimes, casually presenting them as though he'd gathered them by accident on his way home. Rebecca placed them in a blue glass vase on the kitchen table, smiling at the splash of color they added to the room. They developed a comfortable routine. Rebecca rose early to prepare breakfast and pack a midday meal for Matthew if he was working far from the house. He returned in the late afternoon, washing up in the bathhouse before supper. Evenings were spent by the fire, Matthew cleaning his tools or mending harness, Rebecca sewing or reading aloud from one of the books on the shelves. They spoke of daily matters, the cattle, the garden, the weather, but rarely of personal things. Rebecca knew little more of Matthew's past than she had the day they wed, and she shared little of her own. Yet there was a growing ease between them, a companionable silence that felt nothing like the tense quiet of her father's house. Matthew never raised his voice to her, never criticized her efforts, never made her feel less than welcome in his home. Their home, she corrected herself. For it was becoming hers too, this place where she hung curtains she'd sewn and arranged wildflowers in vases, where she knew which floorboard creaked and which window stuck in damp weather. On a warm evening in late May, they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of lowing cattle. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, breaking a comfortable silence. "We should go to town soon. Get supplies for summer, maybe some things for the house you might want." Rebecca nodded, though the thought of returning to Cody filled her with apprehension. "I'd like that." Matthew seemed to read her thoughts. "Your father won't bother you, I won't let him." The simple promise warmed her. "I know." He studied her profile in the fading light. "You're different from when you came, stronger." "Am I?" She hadn't thought about it, but perhaps he was right. The constant fear that had been her companion in Cody had receded here, replaced by a growing confidence in her abilities and her place. "You smile more," he said. "Suits you." The compliment, understated as it was, brought heat to her cheeks. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said quietly. "For giving me this chance." Matthew's hand moved across the space between their chairs, covering hers briefly. "Thank you for coming." The touch was fleeting, but it left her skin tingling long after he'd withdrawn his hand. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising a scorcher of a day. Rebecca rose early to bake, before the heat became unbearable, putting 2 loaves of bread in the oven while the kitchen was still relatively cool. Matthew had already left to move cattle to a higher pasture where the grass remained green. He'd warned her he might be late returning, so Rebecca planned a cold supper that could wait. By midday, the heat was oppressive. Rebecca retreated to the relative coolness of the house, windows open to catch any passing breeze. She worked on mending Matthew's shirts, then read for a while before the warmth made her drowsy. A noise from outside roused her, the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Curious, she went to the door. Matthew rarely galloped near the house. It wasn't Matthew. A stranger dismounted from a lathered horse, a man she didn't recognize with a week's growth of beard and bloodshot eyes. "Hello there, missus," he called, his voice carrying a slurred edge that raised the hairs on Rebecca's arms. "Your man about?" "He's working with the cattle," she answered, not opening the screen door. "Won't be back till evening." The man squinted at her, swaying slightly. "You'd be the new wife then, Foster's girl." Rebecca's heart jumped. "Do I know you, sir?" he chuckled, a sound with no humor in it. "Nah. But your pa does. Owes me money, he does." He took a step toward the porch. "Thought maybe you might square the debt, seeing as your family." Rebecca's mouth went dry. "I have no dealings with my father's business. If he owes you money, you should speak with him." "See now, that's not friendly." Another step closer. "Your pa said you might not be cooperative, said you turned cold after marrying." He grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "But he told me where to find you, said I could persuade you." Fear clenched Rebecca's stomach. Her father had sent this man, to what end? Surely not just for money. The man was on the porch now. "Pretty little thing, aren't you? Can see why Vance snatched you up." Rebecca backed away from the door, mind racing. Matthew kept a rifle by the door, but she'd never fired a gun in her life. The kitchen knives were too far away. "I think you should leave," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My husband won't take kindly to finding you here. He won't be back for hours, by your own telling." The man's hand tested the screen door. Finding it unlatched, he grinned wider. "Plenty of time for you and me to get acquainted." Rebecca backed further into the house, looking frantically for a weapon. The fireplace poker stood in its stand. She lunged for it just as the man pushed through the door. Now," he chided, advancing on her. "That's not very hospitable." Rebecca gripped the poker with both hands. "Get out of my house. Your pa said you turned wild out here, said maybe you needed a reminder of your place." He reached for her, but Rebecca swung the poker, catching him across the forearm. He howled, more in rage than pain, and lunged at her. Rebecca dodged, but her skirt caught on the edge of a chair, tripping her. She went down hard, the poker clattering from her grasp. The man was on her in an instant, his weight pinning her to the floor, his hand at her throat. "That wasn't smart, girl," he growled, his breath hot and reeking of cheap whiskey. "Now I'll have to teach you a lesson before I take you back to your pa." Rebecca fought wildly, scratching and bucking beneath him, but he was too heavy, too strong. Spots danced before her eyes as his grip on her throat tightened. A sudden crash made the man jerk his head up. Matthew stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get off my wife." His voice was deadly quiet. The stranger's grip loosened in surprise, and Rebecca gasped in precious air. "This ain't your concern, Vance," he blustered. "Family matter. Her pa sent me." He never finished the sentence. Matthew crossed the room in 3 strides, hauling the man off Rebecca with one powerful motion and throwing him against the wall. "Rebecca." Matthew's eyes never left the stranger, but his voice gentled when he spoke to her. "Are you hurt?" she coughed, rubbing her throat. "No, I'm all right." The stranger pushed himself away from the wall, glaring. "Foster said I could bring her back, said she was stolen property." Matthew's jaw tightened. "She's my wife, my legal wife. If Roger Foster has a problem with that, he can come himself, not send some drunken thug to assault her." "You calling me a thug?" The man's hand moved toward his hip where a pistol was holstered. Matthew was faster. His own pistol appeared as if by magic, aimed steady at the man's chest. "I'm calling you trespassing. Get out." For a tense moment, Rebecca thought the man might draw anyway, but something in Matthew's eyes, a cold certainty, perhaps made him reconsider. He backed toward the door. "Foster won't like this," he muttered. "Foster can go to hell," Matthew replied evenly. "And if I ever see you within 10 miles of my property again, I'll shoot you where you stand. Now get on your horse and ride." The man slunk out, casting one last venomous look at Rebecca before mounting his horse and galloping away. Matthew holstered his pistol and knelt beside Rebecca, his hands gentle as they touched her face, her throat where bruises were already forming. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have been here." "You couldn't have known," she whispered. Her whole body was trembling now, reaction setting in. Matthew helped her to her feet, leading her to his armchair by the cold fireplace. He disappeared briefly, returning with a glass of whiskey. "Drink this," he urged. "Just a sip. It'll help with the shock." Rebecca took a small swallow, the liquor burning a path to her stomach. "He said my father sent him to bring me back." Matthew's expression darkened. "I believe it. Foster struck me as the type to hold a grudge." He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Rebecca, listen to me. You're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you, least of all your father or his cronies." Tears filled her eyes suddenly, spilling down her cheeks. "I was so frightened." "I know." "But you fought." Pride filled his voice. "You fought him off until help came." Rebecca hadn't thought of it that way. She had fought, not cowered as she might have once done. Matthew's thumb wiped away a tear from her cheek. "You're stronger than you know." The tenderness in his touch undid her. Rebecca leaned forward, burying her face against his shoulder as sobs racked her body. Matthew's arms came around her, holding her gently, one hand stroking her hair. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe now. I've got you." When her tears subsided, Rebecca became aware of their position, her practically in his lap, his arms around her, her face pressed to his neck where she could feel his pulse beating steady and strong. She pulled back slightly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I've soaked your shirt." Matthew didn't release her. "It'll dry," he said softly. His eyes searched her face, lingering on her mouth before meeting her gaze again. "Rebecca." Whatever he meant to say was interrupted by the smell of smoke from the kitchen. "The bread!" Rebecca exclaimed, suddenly remembering the loaves she'd left in the oven. Matthew helped her up, and they hurried to the kitchen where smoke billowed from the oven. The loaves were blackened beyond saving. Rebecca stared at them in dismay, an absurd desire to cry rising again. It's just bread, Matthew said gently, opening windows to clear the smoke. We can make more tomorrow. Rebecca nodded, fighting back tears. It wasn't the bread, of course. It was everything: the attack, the fear, her father's continuing hatred, and now this small domestic failure on top of it all. Matthew seemed to understand. He led her back to the main room and settled her in the chair again. "Rest," he said. "I'll take care of supper." "But I had planned, Rebecca." His voice was firm but kind. "Let me take care of you tonight." No one had ever said those words to her before. Rebecca sank back in the chair, suddenly exhausted. "All right." Matthew moved about the kitchen, putting together a simple meal of cold ham, cheese, and apples. They ate in the main room rather than at the table, Rebecca still in the armchair, Matthew sitting cross-legged on the hearth rug. "I think we should go to town tomorrow," he said when they'd finished eating. "Tell Sheriff Thomas what happened, make it official." Rebecca's stomach knotted at the thought of seeing her father. "Do we have to? If we don't, your father will keep trying." Matthew's eyes hardened. "We need to put a stop to it now." She nodded, knowing he was right. That night Rebecca couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind made her start, imagining the stranger returned. When a floorboard creaked in the hallway, she sat bolt upright, heart pounding. "Rebecca." Matthew's voice came softly through the door. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she lied. Then, "No, I'm sorry. I keep thinking he'll come back." A pause, then, "Would you like me to sit with you for a while?" Rebecca hesitated only briefly. "Please." The door opened, and Matthew entered, wearing only his trousers, his chest bare in the moonlight streaming through the window. Rebecca clutched the quilt to her chin, suddenly conscious of her thin nightgown. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Try to sleep," he said. "I'll stay until you do." Rebecca lay back down, curling on her side facing him. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For saving me today, for being kind." Matthew's hand found hers on top of the quilt, his fingers warm and calloused. "You don't need to thank me for that." "I do," she insisted softly. "My father never was kind, I mean." In the dim light she saw his jaw tighten. "I gathered that. I never knew it could be different," she admitted, "until I came here." Matthew's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "You married to escape a hard life," he said quietly. "I promised myself the day you agreed to come here that you'd learn what soft feels like." The words, so simple yet so profound, brought fresh tears to Rebecca's eyes. "I think I'm beginning to," she whispered. Matthew stayed until her eyelids grew heavy and her breathing deepened. The last thing she remembered before drifting to sleep was the gentle pressure of his lips against her forehead and his whispered, "Sleep well, Rebecca." The journey to town the next day was tense. Rebecca wore her best dress, her hair pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, determined to present a dignified appearance. Matthew was silent beside her, his face set in grim lines. Sheriff Thomas listened gravely to their account of the previous day's events. "I know the man," he confirmed. "Jim Hawkins. Works odd jobs for your father sometimes, Rebecca. Nasty piece of work." "Will you arrest him?" Matthew asked. "I can for trespassing and assault. Your father's trickier." The sheriff sighed. "Unless he explicitly told Hawkins to harm Rebecca, it's his word against Hawkins." "What about sending him to abduct me?" Rebecca asked. "That's more serious. If we can prove it." Sheriff Thomas scratched his chin. "I'll have a talk with your father, Rebecca. Make it clear that you're a married woman now, legally beyond his authority." "I'd like to have that conversation too," Matthew said, his voice deceptively mild. The sheriff shook his head. "Not a good idea, Matt. Let me handle Foster. You take care of your wife." They left the sheriff's office and headed to the general store, not Foster's, but a smaller establishment that had opened recently on the other side of town. Rebecca felt eyes on her as they walked, heard whispers behind hands. Word of her marriage had clearly spread. In the store, Matthew insisted she choose fabrics for new dresses, household linens, and small luxuries she would never have purchased for herself: a bottle of rose-scented toilet water, a tortoiseshell comb to match the ones that had been her mother's. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, a familiar figure staggered down the street toward them. Rebecca's heart sank. Her father, clearly deep in his cups despite the early hour, had spotted them. "There she is," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Rebecca. "The ungrateful little—" "Not another word, Foster," Matthew interrupted, stepping between Rebecca and her father. "Not if you want to keep your teeth." Roger Foster swayed, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "So it's true. My daughter spreading her legs for a dirt farmer." Matthew moved so quickly Rebecca barely saw it. One moment he was beside her, the next he had Foster by the collar, lifting the smaller man nearly off his feet. "That's my wife you're speaking of," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Apologize." Foster sneered, alcohol giving him false courage. "I'll see you both in hell first." Matthew's grip tightened. "You sent a man to assault her, to drag her back here against her will. That wasn't just mean, Foster, it was stupid. Because now I have cause to kill you if you ever come near her again." A crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with avid interest. Sheriff Thomas pushed through, hand on his pistol. "That's enough," he barked. "Matt, let him go." Matthew released Foster, who stumbled backward. "Keep him away from my wife, Sheriff," he warned. "Or I won't be responsible for what happens." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Foster, you're coming with me. We need to have a conversation about sending men to harass married women." He gripped Foster's arm. "The rest of you, show's over. Get back to your business." As the sheriff led her father away, Rebecca released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That wasn't how I imagined our trip to town," she said shakily. Matthew's hand came to rest at the small of her back, a warm, steadying presence. "I'm sorry you had to see that." "I'm not," she said, surprising herself with the realization. "I needed to see someone stand up to him. I spent my whole life afraid of him, Matthew. Seeing him now, he looks smaller somehow." Matthew studied her face. "You're remarkable, Rebecca Vance. Do you know that?" The pride in his voice made her stand taller. "Let's go home," she said softly. The word home hung between them, taking on new meaning. It wasn't just a place anymore, but a feeling of safety, of belonging, of being valued. On the journey back to the ranch, Rebecca found herself stealing glances at Matthew's profile. The stern set of his jaw had softened, but she could still see tension in the line of his shoulders. "Are you angry?" she asked. "About what my father said?" Matthew's hands tightened on the reins momentarily. "I'm angry that he hurt you for years. I'm angry that he tried to hurt you again yesterday." He glanced at her. "But no, I'm not angry at you if that's what you're asking." Relief washed through her. "I was afraid you might regret all this. Marrying me, the trouble it's caused." Matthew pulled the wagon to a halt in the middle of the empty road. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Rebecca, listen to me. I don't regret one moment since you came to the ranch. Not one." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Even yesterday, especially yesterday," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Because yesterday I realized something." "What?" she whispered. "That the thought of losing you terrifies me." His hand came up to cup her cheek gently. "When I saw that man hurting you, I would have killed him if necessary. Not just because you're under my protection, but because you've become important to me." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. "Matthew." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her face. "May I kiss you, Rebecca?" "I've wanted to for weeks now, but I promised myself I'd wait until you were ready." In answer, Rebecca closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a shy, inexperienced kiss. Matthew made a soft sound in the back of his throat, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, holding her gently as he deepened the kiss. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft against hers, coaxing rather than demanding. When they finally broke apart, Rebecca was breathless, her cheeks flushed. Matthew looked equally affected, his eyes dark with emotion. "We should get home," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "before we scandalize anyone who might pass by." Rebecca couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "Yes, we should." The rest of the journey passed in a charged silence, both of them acutely aware of the shift in their relationship. When they reached the ranch, Matthew helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "I'll put the horses up," he said. "Why don't you go inside and rest?" "It's been a difficult day." Rebecca nodded, though rest was the furthest thing from her mind. Inside the house, she removed her bonnet and gloves, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers. Her lips still tingled from Matthew's kiss, and a warm, unfamiliar sensation curled in her stomach when she thought of the way he'd looked at her afterward. When Matthew entered the house some time later, he found Rebecca in the kitchen, preparing supper as if it were any ordinary day. But there was a new awareness between them, a current that made the air seem charged with possibility. They ate by candlelight, though it wasn't their usual custom. Conversation flowed more easily than it ever had, as if the kiss had broken down some final barrier between them. Matthew told stories of his early days on the ranch, and Rebecca shared happier memories of her mother. After the meal, they sat on the porch watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Matthew's arm rested along the back of Rebecca's chair, not quite touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "I meant what I said earlier," he said finally, breaking a comfortable silence. "About you being important to me." Rebecca turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on her face. "You've become important to me too," she admitted softly. "When I agreed to marry you, I hoped for safety, for kindness. I never expected." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "What?" he prompted gently. "To feel this way," she whispered. "Like I belong here, like I belong with you." Matthew's hand moved to cradle her face, his touch reverent. "You do belong here, with me." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "Rebecca, I know our marriage began as an arrangement, but it's become something more to me. Much more. For me too," she confessed. His thumb traced the curve of her lower lip. "I won't rush you, we have all the time in the world." Rebecca covered his hand with hers. "I'm not afraid," she said. And it was true. For the first time in her life, she felt completely safe, completely cherished. Matthew's kiss was deeper this time, more certain. Rebecca responded eagerly, her arms twining around his neck, drawing him closer. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Matthew stood and offered his hand. "Come to bed," he said simply. "To our bed." Rebecca placed her hand in his, letting him lead her into the house, down the hallway, to the bedroom that had been hers alone until now. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, they undressed each other slowly, reverently. Rebecca had expected to feel shy, but Matthew's obvious admiration of her body banished any self-consciousness. His hands and lips explored her with gentle thoroughness, teaching her what pleasure could be. When they finally joined together, the initial discomfort gave way to sensations Rebecca had never imagined possible. Matthew moved above her, his eyes never leaving hers, whispering words of praise and adoration that made her heart swell with emotion. Afterward, lying in his arms, Rebecca felt a sense of completion she'd never known before. Matthew's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, his breathing deep and content. "All right," he murmured against her hair. Rebecca smiled against his chest. "More than all right." He tightened his arms around her. "I love you, Rebecca Vance. I think I have since the moment you stood up to your father in the sheriff's office, determined to make a new life for yourself." The words, so unexpected and yet so right, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't know what that meant until now, until you." Matthew kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her lips. "Sleep now," he said softly. "Tomorrow is a new day, the first of many." Summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. Rebecca's garden flourished under her care, producing more than they could eat. She learned to preserve the bounty, filling the pantry with jars of vegetables, fruits, and jams for the winter ahead. Matthew taught her to ride, and they explored the ranch together during the long summer evenings, discovering hidden meadows and cool streams where they sometimes swam on the hottest days. Their nights were filled with passion and tenderness, each discovery bringing them closer together. Rebecca blossomed under Matthew's love, finding confidence and joy in her new life. In August, Mrs. Winters organized a neighborhood gathering, a rare social event that brought together the scattered ranches and homesteads within a 20-mile radius. Rebecca fretted over what to wear and what dish to bring, nervous about meeting so many strangers at once. "They'll love you," Matthew assured her, buttoning his good shirt for the occasion. "Just as I do." The gathering was held in a meadow near the Winters' ranch, with tables set up beneath the trees and lanterns hung from branches for when darkness fell. Rebecca was introduced to dozens of people whose names she tried desperately to remember: weathered ranchers and their practical wives, young cowboys working the larger spreads, children who ran wild through the grass. To her surprise, she was welcomed warmly. The women admired her preserves and asked for her recipes. The men complimented Matthew on his good fortune with meaningful looks that made Rebecca blush. Even the children took to her, especially a small girl with missing front teeth who attached herself to Rebecca's skirts and insisted on being shown the wildflowers growing at the meadow's edge. As twilight deepened, someone produced a fiddle, and dancing began on a flat patch of ground cleared for the purpose. Matthew led Rebecca into a lively reel, both of them laughing as they navigated the unfamiliar steps. Later, as they swayed to a slower melody, his arms around her waist, his cheek against her hair, Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man. "Happy," Matthew murmured against her ear. "Completely," she answered honestly. That night, as they lay together in their bed, Matthew propped himself on one elbow to look down at her face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I have something for you," he said, reaching for the drawer of the bedside table. Rebecca watched curiously as he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "What is it?" Matthew emptied the contents into his palm, a gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond that caught the moonlight and scattered it in tiny rainbows. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I should have given it to you when we married, but it didn't seem right then when our arrangement was what it was." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she understood what he was saying. "And now I want you to have it as a symbol of a real marriage, a true marriage." He took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger alongside the plain gold band she already wore. "Rebecca Vance, will you be my wife in every sense of the word, not because you needed escape, but because we love each other?" "Yes," she whispered, pulling him down for a kiss that conveyed all the emotion words couldn't express. "Yes, with all my heart." The first snow fell in early November, transforming the ranch into a wonderland of white. Rebecca stood at the window, wrapped in a shawl, watching the flakes drift down from a pearl-gray sky. Matthew came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. "Mm." Rebecca leaned back against him, enjoying his warmth. but a bit frightening too, so isolated. We have everything we need, he assured her. Food in the pantry, wood for the fire, each other for warmth. His hand splayed possessively over her still flat stomach. And soon there'll be 3 of us to keep each other company. Rebecca covered his hands with hers, smiling at the reminder of the new life growing within her. They'd discovered her pregnancy just 2 weeks earlier, and Matthew had been walking around with a permanent smile ever since. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed, turning in his arms to face him. "When I agreed to marry you, I only hoped for safety, for kindness. I never dreamed I'd find this." Matthew's eyes softened as he looked at her. "What's this?" he teased gently. "Love," she answered simply. "A real home, a family of my own." She stretched up to kiss him. "Everything I never knew I wanted." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in soft white silence. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, and Rebecca Vance, once so desperate to escape a hard life, finally understood what soft truly felt like. It felt like home, like love, like the gentle curve of her husband's smile when he looked at her across a room, like the strong arms that held her through the night, like the tiny flutter of new life beneath her heart. It felt, she thought as Matthew's lips found hers in a tender kiss, exactly like this moment and all the moments yet to come. 5 years later, Rebecca sat on the porch swing, watching her 4-year-old son Thomas chase fireflies in the twilight. His delighted laughter carried across the yard as he cupped his hands around the glowing insects before releasing them back into the gathering darkness. "Not too far, Thomas," she called. "Supper will be ready soon." "Yes, Mama," he replied, though his attention remained fixed on the dancing lights. The sound of hoofbeats made Rebecca turn toward the road. Matthew appeared over the rise, their 2-year-old daughter Emma perched before him on the saddle, her copper curls catching the last rays of sunlight. Matthew had taken her along to check the nearest pasture, a special treat for their little girl, who already showed signs of being as horse-mad as her father. Rebecca's heart swelled as she watched them approach. Emma was chattering excitedly, her small hands gesturing as she recounted some grand adventure to her patient father. Matthew's smile was tender as he listened, occasionally nodding or responding to her babbling with perfect seriousness. Thomas spotted them and abandoned his firefly hunt, racing toward the horse with arms outstretched. "Papa, Emmy, did you see cowboys?" Matthew swung down from the saddle, bringing Emma with him. "No cowboys today, partner, just cows. Very boring cows who didn't do anything exciting at all." "But we saw an eagle, Tommy," Emma announced importantly. A real big one indeed," Matthew confirmed, setting Emma on her feet and ruffling Thomas's dark hair. "Nearly carried your sister off, it was so big." Emma nodded solemnly. "Papa saved me." Rebecca smiled at the tall tale, so typical of their bedtime stories. Matthew crossed to the porch and bent to kiss her, his lips warm against hers. "Evening, Mrs. Vance. What smells so good?" "Rabbit stew," she answered. "Mrs. Winters brought us fresh carrots this morning." "MMM." He kissed her again, lingering this time. "Almost as delicious as you." "Matthew," she scolded, though she couldn't help smiling. "The children are completely uninterested in their parents being in love," he finished, glancing at Thomas and Emma, who were now engaged in their own firefly hunt, heads bent together in concentration. Rebecca leaned into his side as he sat beside her on the swing, his arm automatically going around her shoulders. "How are the cattle? Fat and happy. Should fetch a good price when we drive them to market next month." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "How are you feeling?" "Better than this morning." Rebecca placed a hand on her still flat stomach, where their 3rd child was just beginning to make its presence known. "Much better. The ginger tea helps." Matthew's hand covered hers, his expression tender. "I still say it's a boy this time." "Based on what evidence, Mr. Vance?" she teased. "Just a feeling." He winked. "Can a man have intuition too?" Rebecca laughed, the sound as free and joyous as it had been rare in her old life. "I suppose he can." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children's silhouettes against the deepening twilight. The ranch had prospered over the years. The herd had grown. The house had expanded with a new room for the children, and the garden now included a small orchard of fruit trees that Rebecca had planted herself. "I had a letter from Sheriff Thomas today," Matthew said finally. "Your father passed away last week. Liver failure, the doctor said." Rebecca absorbed the news with a complex mix of emotions. She hadn't seen Roger Foster since that confrontation in town 5 years ago. Sheriff Thomas had made sure he understood the consequences of bothering Rebecca or sending others to do so. Occasionally, she heard news of him through Mrs. Winters or others who visited Cody, none of it good. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked gently. "Yes," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I mourned the father he could have been long ago, the man he actually was. I feel nothing but pity for him." Matthew squeezed her shoulder. "You're a better person than he deserved as a daughter." "I had a good teacher in forgiveness," she said, looking up at him. "You taught me that the past doesn't have to define the future." "You taught yourself that, Rebecca. I just provided the space for you to discover your own strength." She rested her head against his shoulder. "Either way, I'm grateful. For this life, for our children, for you." "Thomas, Emma," Matthew called. "Time for supper." The children raced toward the porch, cheeks flushed with excitement and the cool evening air. Thomas launched himself at his father's knees while Emma climbed into Rebecca's lap, her small body warm and solid. "Mama, I caught 7 fireflies," Thomas announced proudly, "and I let them all go so they could find their families." "That was very kind of you," Rebecca said, smoothing his dark hair that matched his father's. "Papa says creatures belong with their families," Thomas recited seriously. "Even bugs." Matthew's eyes met Rebecca's over their children's heads, a lifetime of love and shared understanding in that single look. "Papa's right," she said softly. "Everyone deserves to be where they're loved." Later that night, with the children tucked into bed and the house quiet around them, Rebecca stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the star-filled sky. Matthew's arms came around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder just as it had that snowy day years ago. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his breath warm against her neck. "How different my life would have been if I hadn't had the courage to leave Cody that day. If Sheriff Thomas hadn't suggested I marry you, if you hadn't been the kind of man you are." Matthew turned her in his arms, his eyes serious in the lamplight. "You would have found your way to happiness somehow. You're too strong not to have." Rebecca shook her head. "I wasn't strong then. I was terrified, desperate." "Yet you took a chance on a stranger rather than accept what you knew was wrong. That's courage, Rebecca." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "That's strength." She leaned into his touch. "Perhaps, but I'm glad it was you, that day in the sheriff's office when I first saw you step off that stage." Something in me knew even then. "Knew what?" he asked, a smile beginning at the corners of his mouth. "That you were the beginning of something wonderful, the start of the life I was meant to live." Matthew's kiss was tender, filled with the quiet certainty of their love. When they came together in their bed, it was with the familiar passion that had only deepened over their years together. Afterward, Matthew's hand rested protectively over her stomach where their third child grew. "I meant what I said that day," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "When I told you I wanted you to know what soft feels like." Rebecca smiled in the darkness, remembering. You've kept that promise every day since, and I'll keep it for all the days to come," he vowed. "For you, for our children, for the family we've made together." As sleep claimed her, Rebecca's last conscious thought was of gratitude for the hard life that had driven her to seek escape, for the courage she'd found to reach for something better, and most of all, for the man whose love had shown her that life could indeed be soft, tender, and beautiful beyond her wildest dreams.